My name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and I am back here for our most recent installment of Off-Campus Conversations, which are, the point of which is to follow up with a Thomistic Institute speaker, pursuant to a lecture on campus, or to a retreat, or to a conference, so that way we can just dive deeper on what was proposed in that setting, and just kind of create a bit more of a Thomistic Institute community and conversation here. So for this installment, I'm very delighted to be joined by Professor Edward Feser. Thanks so much for joining Off-Campus Conversations.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Cheers. All right. So all of our listeners will probably know you already from many contributions to the Thomistic Institute podcast or to Thomistic Institute events. I think the first time I met you was at a Newburgh conference where you have been present for many years. And others will know you from your many publications, from your blog, from various contributions. I am actually astonished at the way in which you can weigh in principledly, I don't know what the adverbial form of that word is, regardless, that way, and promptly to contemporary issues with just a solid philosophical grounding, regardless. Okay, so, but for those who don't know you, would you say a word of introduction, who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of philosophy at Pasadena City College in Pasadena, California, and I'm the author of many academic books and articles, and also I write a lot of popular materials, and I've written or edited or been involved with 13 books, ranging from topics from arguments for God's existence to the ethics of capital punishment, to general metaphysics and philosophy of nature, political philosophy, probably a few things I'm forgetting. And I'm currently working on a book on the soul. Some readers will be, and listeners will be familiar with my book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. And I'm doing a book on the soul that's in some ways similar. It sort of does for that topic what the 5 Proofs book did for arguments for God's existence, insofar as I present a broadly Thomistic account of human nature, but in dialogue with contemporary analytic philosophy. So it's also a lot like my book, Scholastic Metaphysics and Aristotle's Revenge, which also engaged in the modern analytic literature in metaphysics and philosophy of science, but defending a broadly Aristotelian Thomistic position. So I do that with this book, but with the topics of the soul. And so the working title is On the Soul and Its Immortality, with a subtitle, A Treatise on Human Nature. Kind of a nod to Hume there, even if not exactly a friendly nod. Anyway, that's a little bit about me and what's going on with me right now.
Okay. I taught a course at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky, and it was supposed to be on Catholic social teaching, so I just made it an RCIA class. And I assigned your book, not that your book is necessarily RCIA class material, Aquinas, and specifically the philosophical anthropology part about the soul. And my students, well, they had just read Alistair McIntyre, so they were totally bemused and bewildered, but they found that very clear and helpful. So I look forward to reading the most recent installment of Ed Feser's Soulcraft. So I thought for this episode, we would talk about the 5 ways, and you've given many lectures and written many things about the 5 ways. But I'm thinking of a line from an article of Lawrence Dewan where he says, in order to engage in this type of discourse, you need to be able to assume a metaphysical mindset. So I thought maybe we could just talk about the disposition of one who approaches these particular, proofs or ways, as it were, to the existence of God, and what, needs to be in place or what gradually falls into place. So with that introduction, what are some good starting points for approaching this type of metaphysical discourse, or physical discourse in certain cases, such that it yields more profitably for the student?
Yeah, so I like that line from Dewan, and I couldn't agree more. In several places, I've drawn a distinction between natural science, philosophy of nature, and metaphysics, each of which takes a progressively deeper view of the nature of reality. So the way I sometimes describe the distinction is this, that natural science is the systematic rational investigation of the actual natural world, material, spatio-temporal world we find ourselves in. Whereas philosophy of nature is the rational investigation of the preconditions of any possible natural world. So it pursues things more deeply than natural science does. It's concerned not just with the actual world of physical things we find ourselves in, but what must be true of any possible empirical, physical, natural world, whatever you want to call it. So it arrives at truths that are deeper than those that are given to us by natural science. And then metaphysics, in turn, is the most fundamental discipline of all, insofar as it studies the rational structure and preconditions of any possible reality, material or non-material, if there is such a thing, which naturally I think there is. And I see philosophy of nature as kind of a branch of metaphysics. Exactly what their relationship is something that Thomists have argued about, but the way I see it is that metaphysics, at least as it's generally understood in contemporary analytic philosophy, is something you could see philosophy of nature as a branch of, basically as applying the sort of analysis we do in metaphysics, but to the structure of the physical world, to the natural world specifically. Now, the reason I bring this up is that, from my point of view, properly to understand the traditional arguments for God's existence, including Aquinas' 5 ways, we have to see that they are exercises not in natural science as that's understood today. They're not presenting theories in physics or chemistry or biology or astronomy or anything like that, or cosmology for that matter, as that's understood in contemporary natural science. But rather, their takeoff points are deeper principles in either the philosophy of nature or in metaphysics. And so the reason I bring up the relationship between those latter two disciplines is to understand them in light of Duan's quote, which is that if we understand philosophy of nature, as I tend to, as a kind of branch of metaphysics, applied metaphysics applied to the natural world, then my position is consistent with Duan's, that in order to properly understand the project of understanding God's existence, you have to have a metaphysical mindset. And in particular, in the case of Aquinas' 5 ways, you have to see that his starting points are not, again, any question or problem in natural science, but rather issues that arise in the philosophy of nature and in metaphysics. So, for example, the first of Aquinas' 5 ways, the argument from motion, begins with an analysis of what must be the case, what the world must be like in order for change to exist in it. And so he brings in the famous Aristotelian theory of actuality and potentiality as the only way to understand how the world can be a world of changing things, contrary to what people like Zeno and Parmenides had to say in pre-Socratic philosophy. Or if we're to go beyond the 5 ways a little bit, considering Aquinas' argument in De Ente et Essentia, the essence existence proof, as it's sometimes called, where he argues from the existence of things in which there's a distinction between their essence and their existence, between what they are and the fact that they are, and argues that the only way to account for them is that there's something in which there is no distinction between essence and existence. There, he's applying a set of concepts and lines of analysis that are drawn from metaphysics. But in neither case is he appealing to the sort of question that a physicist might deal with, or a biologist, as those terms are understood in modern science. Of course, in Aristotle's understanding of physics, which is much broader than the modern conception, Aquinas' argument is his first way as an argument from, quote, physics. But in the modern sense, it's not. It appeals to deeper truths. So anyway, that would be my way of kind of briefly, or as briefly as I'm ever capable of, kind of commenting on Duan's remark, which I'm sympathetic with.
Okay. Okay, so pursuant to the comment about those proofs, my question is, what then are the requisite commitments on the part of the thinking subject? Not because I want to get lost in the thinking subject, but I'm just thinking of, modern and contemporary critiques, which just take their starting point from epistemological or kritiological problematics. It's like, but how do we know that we know that we know? Whereas it seems that St. Thomas presupposes certain commitments on the part of the reasoner to reality, which to a 21st century individual may not be abundantly apparent, especially if you're just immersed in empirical sciences. So can you paint a picture of the type of commitments that need be in place in order for one to approach these arguments well?
Well, so how Aquinas' approach to arguing for God's existence compares to those who are writing on those matters after Descartes and after Kant and so forth is an interesting question. One, and you could defend different answers to these questions. So one thing to note is that Aquinas himself, of course, when he's giving the 5 ways or other arguments for God's existence, he doesn't do a lot of throat clearing the way a modern writer might about how we can even know that there's an external world, how we can know the mind can make contact with it. It's not that he doesn't have things to say about that, but it's not the sort of thing that he thinks is part of a prolegomenon to doing natural theology. He just kind of gets on with, okay, well, look, we observe there's motion in the world. We observe that things are generated and corrupted, as he does in the 3rd way or what have you. Now, some I think 20th century writers, some 20th century Thomists thought, well, maybe this is a problem, and we need to do epistemology before we can get on to the metaphysics, or we need to reframe the natural theology arguments so that they get around Cartesian or Kantian scruples or what have you. And so if that's the case, then, as kind of a preliminary to doing natural theology, you'd have to spell out a Thomistic epistemology and argue that, my way of spelling that out would be that this whole idea that there's this gap between mind and world epistemologically, such that it could in theory be the case that our experiences and our cognitive activity is just as it is, and yet there's no world outside it to correspond to. I don't think that's ultimately coherent. And I think, that there are a lot of contemporary writers, everyone from Wittgenstein to Heidegger to more recent writers like John McDowell and others, who I think give powerful critiques of the whole modern post-Cartesian problematic and show that the whole problematic is based on a set of confusions. And I'm sympathetic to those arguments, but I also think they kind of lend themselves to a Thomistic appropriation. And I do a little bit of that in my book Aristotle's Revenge, and a bit more of it in this new book on the soul that I'm working on. So that's one way to approach it. You could say, well, okay, so we got to do all this kind of epistemology first and then get to natural theology. And it's to some extent it depends on your audience. Some readers and listeners aren't too worried about that sort of thing. So if you're presupposing realism about the outside world, they're going to say, yeah, okay, that's fine. I don't care about that. I don't have any problem with that. Let's go from there. But another approach would be, well, you can kind of bracket all that off and say, look, suppose you buy Descartes' supposition, at least the supposition that he pretends to accept, whether he really does or not. You could argue about that and how to interpret Descartes' meditations. But in the first and second meditations, that this idea that, it could well be that the world is radically different from the way it presents itself to me in experience. You could still arguably run any of Aquinas' arguments just with the starting point that, okay, what I know exists is just myself as a Cartesian ego. But even if that's what I am, and there's no external world, maybe it's all an illusion, maybe it's a deception put in my mind by a Cartesian demon, I still go from potency to act, from potential to actual, as I go through a thought process and entertain these things. I still have the marks of something contingent. I've got limitations on my knowledge, for example. If I'm a Cartesian subject wondering whether I'm awake, I don't know for sure. That's quite a limitation. That points to contingency, and you get a contingency necessity distinction going, and so on and so forth. And there's teleology within me, as I'm a rational agent whose thought processes aim or tend toward the pursuit of truth. Lo and behold, you've got the ingredients for the first way, the third way, the fifth way, and it's the others too. And then you can rise up from those to an argument, the existence of an unmoved mover, or a supreme intellect, or a necessary being, without even getting into this broader question of realism, how the mind relates to the world outside. So that's another approach, is you could bracket off these modern epistemological worries and still do natural theology just from the perspective of the Cartesian subject, if that's your thing, as it were. I hope that speaks to your question.
It does, yeah. That's a nice thing about distinctions like potency and act and essence and existence when it comes to creation or when it comes to creatures. Those types of distinctions, they just go all the way down. So you can just find a point of departure.
They go to the bottom level of reality, exactly. And so So the question of what are the occupants of reality? Is it material substances? Is it immaterial substances? Is it a mixture of both? How are they related as form and matter, as the soul related to the body as form and matter, or is it a distinct Cartesian substance that interacts with it? Okay, those are all very important questions, but for purposes of natural theology, at least to a large extent, you can bracket them off, seems to me.
Yeah. Okay, then maybe adopting another vantage or another tack, thinking in terms of another modern problematic. It's been observed that the modern mind is atomistic, and that it tends to subdivide reality into smallest parts, and it does the same with time, smallest moments. Whereas it seems like in the proofs that St. Thomas advances, you have something more along the lines of, hey, look at this ecosystematic harmony, or look at this causal arrangement that obtains, or look at this fact, that's shot through all of what we perceive or all of what we experience. So maybe, yeah, by way of corrective to a modern difficulty, what are ways in which we can better appreciate the types of relationships which are being described rather than thinking about it as like billiard ball A hits billiard ball B?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends in part on which of Aquinas' arguments we're talking about, right? So, for example, if you're talking about the third way, which is the, often characterized or summarized as the argument from contingency for a necessary being, it probably matters less how right you get your general metaphysics of the physical world, right? So in other words, suppose someone says, well, look, I'm an atomist, or I'm, whatever modern riff on ancient atomism we're talking about. And so I don't buy this idea that a dog or a tree or a stone is a compositive substantial form in prime matter, what have you. I think those things are all reducible, and it's all just particles in motion, particles arranged dog-wise, or whatever people like to say. Okay, I mean, if you want to say that, we can argue about. I mean, I think to some extent you have to get into the details of the nature of dogs and of trees and of stones to see how plausible that sort of view is. But even if you grant it for the sake of argument, you still have some kind of contingency and necessity in the world, which might be enough to give you an argument from contingency to necessity. Someone like Leibniz, of course, gives such an argument. It's not exactly Aquinas' argument for sure, but he gives an argument that's along those general lines, and he's not doing so challenging the basic kind of reductionist model taken for granted by modern philosophy of nature. As a matter of fact, I mean, Leibniz is himself really a kind of idealist, but he thinks ultimately the material world is just a perception of the monads, of minds. But, somebody could study Leibniz's argument for contingency and not even know that, because it doesn't really play a role in the argument, it doesn't factor in, because the distinction between contingency and necessity is just so general that you can apply it however you take the physical world ultimately to be structured. So there's a case where you can bracket off, metaphysical questions to a significant extent. Now, I would not say totally, because, if someone says, okay, but I also take the fundamental particles out of which everything is made to be themselves indestructible, neither created nor destroyed or what have you. Well, I don't think that sort of view ultimately works. I think that even if there were basic atom-like particles, and I mean atom in the older Greek sense, Democritus and Leucippus sense, I think you can't even really make sense of those unless you ultimately attribute to them something like a substantial form prime matter structure, and once we acknowledge they have that, and they've got a certain contingency, which means they're not necessary, they can't be the ultimate reality, and so on. But you could at least delay a lot of the controversial metaphysics of nature, and carry out a lot of the argumentation for that argument. But suppose we're considering the fifth way, okay, which is the argument from final cause to a supreme intellect that orders things to their final cause. Well, I mean, final cause is among the most unpopular parts of Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics from a modern philosophical point of view. It's as hard to sell as anything. But I mean, the whole fifth way is based on that. So if someone said, well, we can carry out like a fifth way and not commit ourselves to Aristotle's understanding of final cause, I would say that's ridiculous. I mean, you're just gutting the entire argument. Now, I would say that there's a sense in which, like William Paley's argument for design, does exactly that. So Aristotle's idea of final cause has to do with directedness toward an end or a tending toward an end that's built into the very nature of something. The acorn of its very nature tends toward becoming an oak. The sulfur in the head of a match, I'm using some of my stock examples, tends toward the generation of flame and heat. That's contrasted with external teleology, which is imposed from outside, like the teleology or final cause that a watch has or something. And so I would say Aquinas' fifth way is grounded in the idea of built-in teleology, as Aristotle understands it. But William Paley's design argument is based on the idea of externally imposed teleology, the kind that a watch has, say, which is why he makes use of this watchmaker analogy. Now, if someone said, well, we can chuck out, Aristotle's idea of teleology for the sake of argument and reformulate Aquinas' argument, his fifth way, without it, I would say, well, I mean, now you're giving Paley's argument, and I don't see Paley's argument as really Aquinas' argument at all. I think it's a very different argument. If you're really giving an Aquinas-style argument, then you're going to have to do a lot of metaphysics of final causality before you give the fifth way. So anyway, these are two examples, the third way and the fifth way, of where I think how much background metaphysics you have to do before you get to argue for God's existence is going to depend on the subject matter and how controversial the background metaphysics is for a contemporary philosophical audience.
Okay. Thinking then again of that audience and of the audience's capacity to prosecute these arguments and then to be convinced by them. I suppose convinced by them can mean a variety of things depending on the setting in which it's interpreted. But what I'm thinking of here is the fact that, like, we don't reason in a vacuum, nor are we disembodied brains that just proceed as if by machine logic through the steps that St. Thomas proposes. This is not even taking into consideration the fact that, you got original sin, we're ignorant, we're malicious, we're weak, we're concupiscent, etc. But that all, kind of set to the side. Still, when we approach these arguments, on the one hand, it seems like we expect too much, or many people expect too much. They expect them to, convince us with a kind of pellucid clarity at the first reading. But then we also, I think, expect too little because we don't necessarily go into all that's entailed by them. So what would you say by way of managing expectations for somebody who's just starting in on the five ways, or maybe working through the five ways for a first systematic time? What would you say to expect and not to expect?
Well, especially if somebody is approaching them without a lot of, or any, especially if they have no acquaintance with classical philosophy in general, by which I mean Plato, Aristotle, scholasticism, that whole scholastic tradition, which I see extending from the ancient Greek tradition up through the Middle Ages, and don't have much awareness of Aristotelianism in particular, they're gonna find the arguments either less convincing than they really are, or they're going to just misunderstand them. Whether they find them convincing or not, they're not likely to understand them. And so in that case, it's really crucial when approaching them for the first time to approach them through some, writer, whether it's me or someone else, who can explain that background and hopefully explain it as painlessly as possible so that the arguments are correctly understood. And that's easier to do with some of them than others. So when I was working on my book, 5 Proofs of God's Existence, and somebody might think, oh, that's a book on the 5 ways. Well, it's actually not. I mean, there's overlap, but the 5 arguments I gave, in fact, as I've told this story before, initially I was going to call it 4 proofs because I thought, I don't want people thinking, Feser's, got a swelled head and he thinks that, well, Aquinas had his 5 ways. Now here's my 5 ways, as if I'm somehow, doing better than Aquinas, which is ridiculous. So I was going to call it 4 proofs, but I thought, well, there are really 5 arguments that I think are really the strongest, and I want to give all of them in this book. So I just I'm just going to do 5 proofs and just live with the consequences. So, but the 5 proofs are not exactly Aquinas's. Now, that's not because I don't think Aquinas's 5 ways all work. I do, in fact, think they all work. And it's people who say, well, Feser's a Thomist hack. Of course, he has to say they all work. And that's not why. I mean, there are things with, that Aquinas says I don't necessarily agree with. But I think that the 5 ways, when properly understood in their larger metaphysical context, once you've got kind of the background metaphysics in place, you've got hylomorphism, the form, matter, structure of physical objects. You've got the theory of actuality and potentiality. You've got final causality. You've got the doctrine of the transcendentals, that being, unity, truth, goodness are really the same thing looked at from different points of view. That's especially relevant to the 4th way. And I think there are independent reasons to accept all that. Once you've got all that in place, I think the 5 ways actually follow pretty naturally from that. There's a kind of organic unity, the entirety of the whole system, that such that you accept a fair bit of it, you're in for most of the whole thing. So I don't think it's terribly surprising once you understand Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics in detail that the 5 ways should all be compelling arguments. However, even though I think that's the case, and I've defended all of them in my book on Aquinas, for example, I don't find them all equally useful for convincing the average modern reader, whether it's someone who's trained in modern philosophy or in modern science or otherwise. And the reason is that with some of them, there's just way too much heavy lifting in the way of general metaphysics that's required first before you can understand the argument. And in some cases, there's so much that I'll give you an example of the 4th way. When you understand enough of the general Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysical system to see why the 4th way is a powerful argument, it's the argument from degrees of perfection to a supremely perfect being, for listeners who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about. Once you see why that is actually a powerful argument, you've already taken on board so much Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics that you're probably a theist anyway by that point. Whereas, with the 1st way, for example, which is Aquinas himself called it the more manifest way. He thought it was the most sort of intuitively compelling argument of the 5 ways, and I think he's probably right about that. You don't need to really get into too much beyond the Aristotelian theory of actuality and potentiality, and then you're kind of on the way. And you get pretty, directly to the existence of what I call an unactualized actualizer or an unmoved mover with just that, or, maybe a little bit more than that. But there's less in the way of the whole Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysical system you've got to take on board in order to see the power of that argument. So for that reason, the 1st way I consider, your mileage may vary, different people have different views on this, but I consider it the most useful for sort of getting people who aren't already initiated into Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy to see that there are powerful arguments for the existence of God. And so, in my book, 5 Proofs, that's one of the arguments I develop. I call it the Aristotelian proof there because Aquinas gets it from Aristotle. And then there's several others, one of which also comes from Aquinas, the argument in On Being in Essence, or De Ente et Essentia, where he goes from the distinction between things that have a different essence from their existence to a first cause whose essence and existence are identical. That's a very abstract metaphysical argument, but that's another one of Aquinas' arguments. But then I defend a version of Leibniz's argument from contingency to a necessary being, and that's in the general family of Aquinas' 3rd way, which is also an argument of contingency. But the way Aquinas spells it out requires a bit more in the way of philosophy of nature. As I said earlier, you don't have to go the whole hog for everything Aquinas says about philosophy of nature in order to get the 3rd way off the ground. But you need some kind of form-matter distinction, whereas you don't necessarily need that for Leibniz's version. So to kind of streamline things, I decided to kind of follow Leibniz's general approach with that argument. So anyway, this is all a kind of long-winded way of saying that, which argument is most suitable and going to be accessible to a modern reader. It's going to depend on how much of the general metaphysics that informs the argument is needed in order to understand it. And, when acquainting oneself with it requires, maybe reading someone who kind of understands that metaphysics and can bring it to bear on the exposition of the argument.
Okay, so I'm thinking about, some people would explain progressive acclimatization to Aquinas' five ways, just as a matter of what, like discipline or doctrine, as a matter of educating oneself, which is true. Some might just describe it as kind of more along the lines of familiarity, or it's something that takes place in time and has an historical dimension, to which we need to be sensitive, which is, true in its own way. But I also think there's a sense in which, you can describe it as acquiring the contemplative habits of mind and heart, which dispose you well to the reception, as it were, of the revelation, in scare quotes, of what the five proofs hold. Just tapping in a little bit to this kind of ancient notion of theoria, which is picked up among the desert fathers and then transmitted through the church's tradition. So maybe just thinking about the five ways as the fruit of contemplative discourse and also contemplative maturation. What are maybe some of the cathartic or purgative exercises that need to be undertaken in order to free one for that type of pursuit, so that he is not always weighed down, as it were, by things which distract him from the ultimate fruit of this type of inquiry?
Well, that's a very interesting and excellent question. And I think, as you indicate, the five ways are part of this broad tradition that looks at philosophy as a contemplative in its nature, as you say, which means, among other things, that it's part of a general attitude toward life, or a way of life. And this contrasts this classical and medieval understanding of philosophy with the contemporary attitude in a very deep way. There's a tendency in contemporary philosophy, first of all, to see it as very much an academic and impractical sort of discipline. With some contemporary academic philosophers, you get the sense that they see philosophy as basically a kind of, it's like solving puzzles, but you get paid for it, and you get to hang out with students and introduce the puzzles to them, and all sit around and have fun and go out and a beer afterward. It doesn't go any deeper than that. It's just a total banalization of philosophy, which for a Socrates, who's traditionally the model for philosophers, I don't think he's seen that way by a lot of contemporary philosophers. Some of them maybe, but for someone like Socrates, but also for Plato and Aristotle and all the great names in the tradition up through the Middle Ages, there's really nothing that, there's nothing that could be more important. Everything's at stake in philosophy, the very meaning of one's own life and the life of the society and the world around them, and so on and so forth. And this reflects the idea that the spirit in which it's done is that one is pursuing truth for its own sake, and in a way that's absolutely consistent. And that requires a kind of honesty with oneself and a willingness to conform oneself to the truth that, I think a lot of modern people are not willing to do. And they don't even really see it as something worth doing, because it's hard to do that if you just see philosophy as, kind of solving fun puzzles and so forth, and you trivialize it that way. Now, the way this ties into the five ways is this, that if the spirit in which we approach philosophy is that, look, the reason that we're doing philosophy is we want to understand the world. We want to know what the world is and why it's the way it is. And part of what that involves is a quest for explanations. We don't just want to know what there is out there and what its structures. We want to know why it's the way it is, where it comes from, what accounts for it, and so on. And that, of course, is the main project that was introduced by the pre-Socratics and the inheritors of the pre-Socratics, which is all of us in philosophy and science. We're engaged in that very same pursuit of trying to understand why things are the way they are, ultimate explanations. Now, I would say when you follow out the very idea of ultimate explanation, it's very hard to avoid theism. I don't think you can. Theism of some sort, because it's very difficult, and I would say impossible, to even make sense of the idea of an ultimate explanation, a place where the explanatory buck stops, as it were, without the idea of something like some feature of reality that's absolutely necessary and could not be otherwise, could not be other than it is. Where when you unpack that, this is the idea of a necessary being. It's going to be, I would say, the idea of something that's pure actuality, something that's absolutely simple, and so on. And once you get that, you're really a theist of some sort. And now the only question remaining is, what is the nature of this God whose existence we've arrived at, not the existence? Okay. I think all of that actually is kind of embedded in the very project of ultimate explanation. But to see that, you have to be looking for it, right? You have to be looking for an ultimate explanation. You have to be deeply committed existentially, as it were, to the pursuit of achieving as complete as possible an understanding of the world as we're capable of finding the truth about the world. Now, if instead you look at philosophy as just kind of a puzzle-solving activity, it's kind of a fun little game, and if you got a trolley and if it goes on this side of the track, you're going to kill one person. If you go this side, you kill 10, and these sort of dumb little puzzles people come up with. You're not serious enough about what you're doing in order to be even interested in seeing the power of an attempt at ultimate explanation like the 5 ways represent. And one more thing before I pause here. Another highly regrettable part of contemporary intellectual life, which has only gotten worse with the rise of the internet, is that intellectual activity also, not only is it seen as puzzle solving, but it's like a competitive puzzle solving, right? Where you're trying to one up the other person, and public exchanges over questions of the most ultimate importance, the existence of God, moral questions, metaphysical questions, the nature and implications of science, end up being clashes of egos, and all sorts of political interests get to be associated with them. So that the way people tend to look at intellectual engagements is, well, there's my side and there's this other side, and the goal is to make my side look good and the other side look stupid. And that's the spirit in which these things are approached. So often, if it's debates about arguments for God's existence that are in play, there's a lot of this sort of spirit in which it's done, a lot of trash talking, and I blew this guy out of the water, and I showed he was an idiot. It's childish, but it's deeply unphilosophical. And where the classical model of philosophy is we're engaged in a common pursuit, which is the truth, and we're sort of friends in this enterprise of seeking this common end of the truth, rather than just sort of self-aggrandizement or upholding some partisan interest or what have you. So the point I'm trying to make is that you talk about what sort of spiritual state one ought to be in order properly to understand these sort of arguments. And I would say ideally one should approach philosophy in general as the pursuit of truth, and that includes ultimate explanation, rather than just a matter of solving clever puzzles or of a clash of egos in the public sphere, trying to make your side look good and the other side look bad. That's the wrong sort of approach really to take toward any philosophical issue, but certainly one where the stakes are as high as whether God exists.
Yeah. And with that point too, the questions with which I began, of ignorance and malice and weakness and concupiscence, they come back up because insofar as one has not cultivated some modicum of virtue, it becomes exceedingly difficult to harness the aforementioned ego. Because then the fear of being shown wrong asserts itself with such vehemence that you only think of like defending yourself or kind of buffering yourself from the potential conflict which might arise should you be proved inadequate to the task. So yeah, internet debates, such a fascinating phenomenon.
I mean, I think if I can just elaborate just a little bit more, and I do want to step on what point you want to make, but these things ultimately, I mean, they're really deep issues, require a certain measure of tranquility, adequately and seriously to address. And internet exchanges don't lend themselves to that. And over the years, I've seen it. We can all think of examples of people who've really gone into some nutty and disturbing areas. They've fallen into some weird views, or they've had sort of public meltdowns and so on, because they're simply too engaged in the controversy du jour. They're too engaged in the political, partisan, and other controversies of the moment, and it affects the way they see matters of religion, matters of ethics, and this is just not a good way to arrive at views about those things. It's not a good way to approach the question of whether God exists, or whether Christianity is true, or questions of, fundamental questions about ethics. Those things have to be approached with a certain measure of tranquility But you can't have tranquility if you're always worried about who said what on Twitter this week, or who said what on this blog, or who's going to win the election, all that kind of stuff. And so you have to detach yourself from that to some extent. And the more one finds oneself sort of fraught and whipped up and constantly angry, constantly anxious, that's a sign you're not really going to approach these things responsibly or well. And so I think someone has, if someone's engaged in online debate and finds that that's their constant mindset, they probably should disengage. And only when they're capable of having a certain tranquility and looking at the online engagements as they're kind of a supplement to the serious stuff, where the serious debates are the ones that you can engage in without having to log in every morning and see what's going on online. And instead, you can be there by yourself with a book, having an engagement, you might say, with a mind that existed 100 or 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, where what the person has to say to you is just as relevant now as it was then, and where you can kind of sit back and contemplate what they're saying and try to understand it and see whether it's true without worrying about, okay, but how's this going to play on Twitter? How's this going to play on in some contemporary political discussion? That stuff ultimately is of secondary or tertiary importance. So one has to cultivate this kind of tranquility of mind in order to do these things well.
Yeah, and I think too that kind of helps orient even these type of exchanges. Like, what's the point of the Thomistic Institute podcast? It's to get off the Thomistic Institute podcast, right? It's to encounter certain people who propose certain things with which you can follow up, typically in a written medium, and then foster the relationships which will ultimately like see you through a life of contemplation and study, which, please God, ends in heaven. But yeah, I think I think about that often, insofar as we get so accustomed to listen to podcasts when we're going hither and thither to the point where we can't be alone, we can't be silent, we can't think about things unaccompanied by background noise. It can become dangerous. So yeah, maybe that's a good way to wrap up the episode as we kind of lapse into a respectful silence. Okay, so
for Lent.
Yeah, exactly. So for those who do want to follow up in a written medium, we talked about the Aquinas book, which has a good 50, 60 pages on the 5 ways or the 5 proofs of Aquinas himself. And then we talked about the 5 proofs book, which has, a kind of Aristotelian and Platonic inspiration, but goes beyond into more modern proofs as you described. Are there other things that you would recommend apropos of this conversation?
Well, I mean, if you're asking about my own work, people can check out my website, edwardfeser.com, and they'll find information about and links to articles, other books, other writings, other video resources, and the like.
Excellent. Wonderful. And the Thomistic Institute has recently, I think they're doing dueling Aquinas 101 courses right now. The one is on the sacraments, and then the other one is on the 5 ways. So a deep dive with different, priests and professors from the House of Studies and beyond. So yeah, check those out as well. So then turning to you, the listener, thanks so much for having tuned into this episode of Off-Campus Conversations on the Thomistic Institute podcast. And we will look forward to chatting with you at the next opportunity, unless between now and then you've made the decision to tap out, for which decision we congratulate you. All right. Know of our prayers for you. Please pray for us, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next time, should that happen, on the Thomistic Institute podcast.